I'm wearing it, you see? My rainbow loom bracelet, Tom. Thank you. Um, yeah, so you all look nothing like I imagined, which is, of course, an old radio joke. And as Tom said, if you have heard me on the radio, on the TED Radio Hour, and it's just a little weird to see me standing up here, you can close your eyes. I won't be offended. It'll be just like your radio experience. So I host a program on NPR. It's called the TED Radio Hour. Has anybody heard the show here? Yeah, a few of you? Great. We describe it as a journey through big ideas. Some of our listeners call it a cult. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. Anyway, for the job, I sometimes travel to the Silicon Valley and talk with people in the tech world. And recently, I was there, and I noticed that there's a direct correlation between the type of dress and how wealthy somebody is. So, for example, when you see people wearing, tattered jeans and, flip-flops and T-shirts, the kind of T-shirts you would use to wash your car, you're talking to a billionaire. And I was thinking about it just a few minutes ago, because as I look out into this room, I see such well-dressed people, and so I have to assume you are all very, very poor. So sorry about that, but I guess that would make sense, because we are at a conference with people who have taken a vow of poverty to help make the world a better place. So thank you for that. Thank you. So as a fellow employee of a nonprofit, National Public Radio, we are a nonprofit. I am honored to be here with you. NPR is actually the only nonprofit, non-governmental news organization of its kind in size and scope. We are, almost entirely funded by listener contributions and by grants. In fact, I think our entire contributor base is probably represented in this room right now. So thank you for your donations to your local station as well. But really, our basic mission is the same as yours. It's to serve the public, right? That's what we do. We do that because of our shared purpose, because of our commitment to telling stories that we believe help our democracy function better. We have 17 international bureaus, we have 12 domestic bureaus, and frankly, nobody else in the news business does what we do. Nobody else in the news business has the guts or the courage to interview penguins in Antarctica, and we do that. That really happened. That's Ira Flato, who hosts Science Friday. That's back in the early 80s in Antarctica, interviewing penguins. Anyway, as many of you know too well, in recent years, your job has become a lot tougher, right? Because the resources are not quite what they once were for many of us, and yet the expectations on us have become so much greater, right? People depend on what we do, what you do, so much more. And I think that this will become an even bigger challenge as we sort of head into the future. I also think it'll become an opportunity. So what do I mean by that? Well, it is somewhat appropriate that we are here in Washington, D.C., and I plan to talk about collaboration and narrative today because, as you all know, Washington, D.C. is the place where collaboration comes to die. And it's true. It dies here in Washington. And really, recent years have proved that this town is the least collaborative in the country. This is the freshman class of the 113th Congress, the current Congress. This current Congress will actually have the honor of being known as the least productive in modern history. 10 years ago, Congress passed on average 500 pieces of legislation a year. Last year, this Congress passed about 52. Only half of them were considered substantive, and when I say substantive, I'm talking about laws, for example, that mandated that all loose change at airports be given to USO lounges. That was one of the 24 substantive pieces of legislation passed last year. But I would argue that a big reason why this is happening in Congress is because there really is an absence of shared purpose. There's an absence of leadership on all sides. There's no shared narrative. And as a result, there's really an unwillingness to collaborate. So I once interviewed a few years ago a wonderful man, a former congressman named Dan Glickman from Kansas. And he was talking about when he first came to Washington in the 1970s, how he would instantly look for other members around his age, Democrat or Republican, didn't matter. They would find common interests, their spouses would hang out, they'd go out to dinner, their kids would go to the same schools. And that really had an impact on the way that he was able to do his work, on the way they were able to actually get big problems solved. Today, almost none of the members from one party hang out with members from the other party. In fact, it's more likely that they barely know members from the other side of the aisle. And this has been a steady phenomenon in Washington over the past 2 decades. And it's really created this sort of tribal attitude among members who tend to be fiercely ideological and committed to a particular ideology. And actually today, a growing number of members, as some of you know, will actually live in their offices. This is a congressman unfolding his mattress at night, getting ready to go to bed. It doesn't look that comfortable to me, but apparently to many of them it is comfortable. There's a bigger problem here. What it means is that a lot of these members don't develop the kinds of relationships that are necessary to collaborate. They don't go out to dinner with other members of Congress. They don't talk about big ideas. And then when they talk about Washington, it's with contempt. They talk about Washington as a place of bureaucracy, red tape, regulation, waste, fraud, abuse to many people. And for those who believe that government is all of those things, that government is the problem, and that it's incapable of solving problems, you can actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy by ensuring that this will be the case. So in fact, you now have elected officials in Congress who have turned this idea into a campaign slogan. This is a quote from one of them. He ran on government that did less. That was his campaign slogan. So if government isn't really allowed to find solutions, and then government can't properly serve the public, then government increasingly becomes irrelevant in the minds of the public. I believe that's a tragedy because for all of its flaws and inefficiencies, good government, collaborative government has the capacity to change, to bring about change at scale. But it also means that we're living at a time when groups like yours and ours are in many cases picking up the slack where government cannot or is not providing. And it means, as you all know, that many, many, many people rely on what you do every single day. Groups represented here, like the IRC, that goes to places like South Sudan and Syria, stands up health clinics and education facilities, while much of the world remains silent. Water for People that provides sanitation and clean drinking water to people in 9 different countries. I mean, all of you do work at a time when resources are limited, when the pool of money available to you is finite, and when the pressure to show your donors the details of how their specific contribution is being used is actually greater than ever. Now, all of you do work that has impact, that literally changes lives. But in a world where so much information is available to us, right, where it becomes really difficult to separate and differentiate the signal from the noise, framing your story is more important than it ever has been. Because without a good, clear narrative, it's difficult to explain just how profound the impact actually is. So there's a quote that I think about a lot, and I've been thinking about a lot over the past few weeks, knowing that I would come speak to you. And it's a quote that I have in my office by the Dalai Lama. And this is the quote. He says, "Just as ripples spread out when a single pebble is dropped into water, the actions of individuals can have far-reaching effects." Now, it seems so intuitive, it seems so clear, right? But when you think about it, what matters isn't really the action of the individual, it's the ripples from that action. All of us know the story of one of the most remarkable women in American history, Rosa Parks. And the story most of us know is that on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was tired. She was tired after a day of pressing and ironing trousers. And we know that soon after she boarded that bus in Montgomery, Alabama, it filled up. Now, Rosa Parks was sitting in the section that was designated for African Americans, for non-whites. But because the bus was full, the bus driver moved that sign 3 rows back where Rosa Parks and 3 other African Americans were sitting. He asked the passengers to stand up to make room for the white passengers. 3 of those passengers did stand up, and only Rosa Parks stayed seated. For that act, she was arrested promptly, and the civil rights movement was launched. Now, if only history were that simple. Because in actual fact, and as many of you may know, nearly 10 years before Rosa Parks, a woman named Irene Morgan did nearly the same thing in Virginia. In the 15 months preceding Rosa Parks, 4 other women were arrested in that same city of Montgomery, Alabama, for doing the same thing, including a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin, who resisted her arrest. She was tried and she was convicted of only one charge, which was resisting arrest. But Claudette was also pregnant, and she was unmarried at the time. And civil rights leaders and local leaders, and the local head of the NAACP chapter in Montgomery, Edgar Nixon, didn't think that Claudette Colvin was the right symbol to rally the community around. So they waited. Now, Rosa Parks wasn't simply a seamstress who was tired after a long day of work. That is true. But she was also a volunteer at the NAACP, and she also worked part-time as a secretary to Edgar Nixon. She was aware of Claudette Colvin. She knew about her story. But she also knew that Nixon and the NAACP were looking for a better test case, a person who could help spark the movement that, of course, became the most profound and consequential movement in American history. Now, there were attempts by African American leaders in Montgomery to mount bus boycotts years before Rosa Parks, but they didn't work because the community wasn't yet organized. So when Rosa Parks carried out one of the most important acts in American history, the African American leadership in Montgomery was ready. They were prepared. Rosa Parks was arrested that evening, December 1st, 1955. Ed Nixon was immediately called. He and Fred Gray, a young African-American civil rights attorney in Montgomery, began to work the phones. They reached out to other local activists, African-American activists. They all agreed they had found their moment. Overnight, they mimeographed 55,000 flyers calling for a boycott of Montgomery's bus system. The next morning, Edgar Nixon got in touch with a young minister, a relative newcomer to Montgomery, Martin Luther King. Dr. King agreed to help mobilize his fellow ministers, and on Sunday, at black churches throughout the city, they spread the message. The next day, Monday, the boycott would begin. They arranged carpools and other forms of transportation to make sure that African Americans could get to work without using buses. For 381 days, Montgomery's African Americans refused to ride those buses. Those city buses stood idle. It brought the bus system to its knees. And in fact, the only thing that saved it from total collapse was a Supreme Court order forcing the city of Montgomery to repeal its law on segregation, bus segregation. So Rosa Parks was an individual, but the ripple effect of her single act, the organization, the collaboration, the common mission, that's what changed the country, and that's what changed the world. Now, could the Rosa Parks story have happened without the organization, without the leadership, without the community that was ready and in place to turn that single act into the most powerful social movement in American history? Maybe it's possible, but far less likely. Because the civil rights movement was, in many ways, the perfect movement. Now, that's not to say there wasn't infighting or at times competing interests and goals. There were. But ultimately, it was the perfect movement because it was a movement built on collaboration. And the movement was able to succeed as a collaboration because it contained 4 crucial ingredients. There was a shared purpose and a shared sense of mission. And of course, that was to break a system that dehumanized a whole segment of the American population. You had strong leaders, people like Edgar Nixon, Ralph Abernathy, Martin Luther King. You had an organization in place that was built and ready when the time was right to launch. It wasn't just the NAACP, but other activists and church leaders across the South who could mobilize their supporters and congregants quickly. And finally, and I think arguably most importantly, there was a narrative, a clear and compelling and powerful narrative that resonated with people on a very simple emotional level. Rosa Parks suffered an indignity that millions of African Americans had suffered every single day. And that single indignity was a single cell in a whole cancerous system that was undermining the strength of America. And so, far beyond Birmingham, people were inspired by Rosa Parks. They were inspired by her courage and her dignity and everything it represented. And those four things, shared purpose, leadership, organization, narrative, when they come together, it's like a perfect storm driving change. Sometimes they come together because of serendipity, but that's rare. I mean, more often than not, they come together because they are built through hard work and strategy and planning and thinking. Now, many of you will remember this video, Kony 2012. This came out in March 2012. It was a video about the war in Central Africa and the Lord's Resistance Army, which of course forces children to fight in its brutal militia. And the video was a call to action, a call to find and bring to justice the warlord Joseph Kony. The group behind it is called Invisible Children. And within a few hours of the release of this video, Kony 2012 became the fastest viral video in history. And that record still stands, by the way. I remember at the time I was hosting All Things Considered, and one of my production assistants just out of college came to our morning meeting and he said, "There is something on Facebook and it's going to blow up. All of my friends are posting this. It's going to be all over the place by the end of today." So I went and watched this video, and I was instantly taken in. I mean, when does a 30-minute video go viral, right? When does that happen? I mean, you know, without any cats in the video, by the way. It was just 30 minutes of great content. Now, I had never heard of Invisible Children, and neither had any of my colleagues in the newsroom. And so we put in a call to the organization to interview the young man behind this video. His name is Jason Russell. I knew nothing about him. We booked an interview with him for later in the week, and that was it. But as the day wore on, mainstream journalists started to ask questions about the group. Who were they? Who was behind them? How does an unknown group all of a sudden capture the world's attention so quickly, having had no mainstream presence? The scrutiny and the pressure on the group and the criticism was intense. Were they arming African soldiers to fight the LRA? Was this a scam? Did they have a secret agenda? Were they naive? That pressure began to weigh on Invisible Children, and especially the creator of this video, Jason Russell. Many of you will remember Jason's very public breakdown just a few days after the release of that video. And so because of so much uncertainty, we actually canceled our interview with Jason. Much of the mainstream press concluded that Invisible Children was a flash in the pan that got lucky with a viral video, and they moved on. In our arrogance, we could not comprehend the possibility that maybe, just maybe, Invisible Children had laid the groundwork for that video nearly a decade earlier. Now, Invisible Children isn't without controversy, but the story of the group is so much more complicated than a one-off viral video. And it actually began 10 years earlier in March of 2003, when Jason Russell and two friends from film school decided to go to Africa to shoot a documentary about Sudan. By chance and circumstance, they were diverted to Congo, right in the middle of one of the continent's longest-running conflicts, and there they encountered hundreds of children sleeping in bus stations, terrified at the prospect of being kidnapped and forced to become child soldiers. And it was on that trip when Jason and Bobby and Laren, who you see in this photo, they met a young boy who witnessed his own brother's death. He was a sensitive boy, and his only dream was to become a lawyer. And that night, Jason made a promise to that boy. He said, "You will not be forgotten." And upon their return to the US, these three filmmakers made a decision that would change their lives, it would change the lives of thousands of African children and thousands of American teens. And that decision was to found Invisible Children. They took their footage, they made a powerful film, and they tried to get it into every single film festival. These were filmmakers, they were professionals, they were very good at what they do. Sundance, Tribeca, Toronto, you name it. Not a single festival accepted their documentary. Now remember, this is long before YouTube, this is long before video was easily shared on the web. So they started to brainstorm. And with help from friends, they decided that they were going to take that film and they were going to screen it themselves at high schools all across the country. They started to make cold calls to schools. They contacted every single teacher they knew, friends of teachers. They scraped together a bit of money from friends and family. And over the next 6 years, they took that film around the country and they began to build a movement and an organization from the roots up. At the end of the film, there were no credits. It didn't say this film was made by Jason Russell, and it just said this. It said, the story is not over yet. We need one of the following from you: your time, your talent, or your money. And slowly and strategically, and with a shared sense of purpose, with focused leadership and a clear narrative, these young men built an organization made up of thousands of volunteers. Young people, high school students, with the will and the passion and the naivete to believe that they could end this conflict and bring Joseph Kony to justice. They amassed hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter, on Facebook. They encouraged their volunteers to collaborate, to take ownership and control over their part of the mission. They invited young people to join them at their headquarters in San Diego to stuff envelopes, go door to door, to do the hard work that was required to make a difference. And none of this was ever in the New York Times. None of this was on CNN. None of this was, dare I say, on NPR, because it was all happening under the radar screen. And so when this team from Invisible Children launched Kony 2012, they had already built up the foundation, a movement that was ready to spread this message in ways none of us had anticipated. And that video didn't go viral because the group was lucky. It went viral because hundreds of thousands of young people were waiting for that moment to spread the word. And I don't believe that it's an understatement to call Invisible Children the most powerful millennial-led movement to date. And on the ground in Central Africa, they have set up radio stations where they inform child soldiers how to defect. They've dropped hundreds of thousands of leaflets into the dense jungles with instructions telling child soldiers how they can escape. They've helped achieve a 90% reduction in LRA killings between 2010 and 2013, the rehabilitation and return of more than 200,000 displaced persons to their homes, and a law signed by President Obama in the Oval Office last year authorizing a $5 million reward leading to the capture of Joseph Kony and his top 5 lieutenants. One of those people in the room that day was Ben Kesey. He's here today in this room, standing with the president while he signed that law. And all this happened because Invisible Children gathered around a shared mission with a shared sense of purpose. It was led by highly talented men and women, young men and women. They created a robust organization of young volunteers and activists around the country and the world, and they had and they continue to have a clear and powerful narrative. And what they understood, what those 20 and 30-somethings at Invisible Children understood intuitively, is something that scientists and researchers have confirmed with empirical data, that humans, and by the way, even primates, are wired to be collaborative. Humans more than primates, just for the record. But we all seek to be part of something bigger. We all understand that the work we do can't happen in isolation, right? There has to be a shared purpose. There has to be good leaders and a good organization and a narrative. If you look at the history of great achievements in science and technology, you'll more often than not find that the same exact ingredients exist. And the ability, most importantly, to collaborate not just internally, but outside the group. So let me give you an example of what I mean. This is a guy named Bob Taylor. To the right of him is a group of shaggy-haired hippie scientists who he recruited in the late 60s and early 70s to work with him at Park Xerox. And Bob, who I was lucky enough to meet and get to know and interview a few years ago, he was not the smartest guy in the room, which is actually exactly what made him such an effective leader. A few years before this photo was taken, Bob headed up DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency at the Pentagon. He is not a scientist, he's not a computer scientist, he's actually, his background's in psychology. And what Bob was really interested in was expanding human interaction. And it just so happened that in 1968, Bob was asked by the Pentagon to build a computer network that could be used by the military in a secure and rapid way to communicate with one another. But Bob saw far beyond that limited scope. In fact, that year he published a paper, and it was theoretical at the time, but in that paper he wrote that he could envision creating a network that would serve as a great disseminator of information to the public, that would include dictionaries and encyclopedias and commerce and education tools, communications programs. This is in 1968. So he began to gather a team of very smart engineers who understood the technology better than he did. And they spent the next year figuring out how to make this work. And under the leadership of Bob Taylor, this motley team of engineers came to see that they were building something that could possibly change the world. A little more than a year later, on the night of October 29th, 1969, a few of those engineers, some at Stanford's Research Institute, some at UCLA, sent the first email message. And they wanted to write something, profound, like "What hath God wrought?" or something like that. But instead, the first message that they decided to write was "Login," L-O-G-I-N. There was a young engineer named Charlie Klein at UCLA who was tasked with typing in what would become the first email message. So he typed in an L, and then he typed in an O, and then the system crashed. So the first email was L-O. This is the email that changed the world. And that day marked the start of a period of incredible invention and imagination, and it came about because of people like Bob Taylor, who understood that great projects required great collaboration, and great collaboration required a shared sense of mission. By the way, besides the internet, which Bob actually did invent, the team that gathered around him at Park Xerox built the personal computer, the computer mouse, the Ethernet system, and the laser printer, which I know there looks like a giant copy machine or file cabinet, but that was the first laser printer. And all of these things were invented by his team. And what he realized, and what he told me when I interviewed him, was that after the mission was accomplished, he realized that everybody felt a sense of ownership. Everybody owns it. Rarely is a collaborative effort attached to a single name or a single personality. So, can anyone in this room guess what the greatest mass collaboration in human history was? The moon landings, maybe, or the Panama Canal, or the storming of the beach at Normandy? Maybe somebody guessed it and I didn't hear it. All incredible feats. But actually the greatest in terms of numbers, the greatest collaboration in human history is Wikipedia. 80 million people have taken part in building Wikipedia. And it could only be done because of the power of the internet and technology. But it also required an organization. It required leaders with a vision. It required leaders who had shared a common purpose and a narrative and had a story to fuel that mission. So when Jimmy Wales and Larry Sanger and a few friends got together in 2001 to create what would become Wikipedia, they were all motivated by the same thing: to make information accessible and available to everyone around the world for free. To bring a library right into your personal space. Today, of course, Wikipedia is huge. It's the 5th most visited website in the world. 19 billion page views a month. 80,000 full-time volunteers edit this site to make sure it's accurate. So the question is, what would motivate millions of people to contribute hours of their time to collaborate on something for free? And this is a question that I asked Jimmy Wales. And his answer might surprise you. Because it's fun. Because they do it for fun. Because when they're done, they've realized that they have made the world a little bit better than it was when they started. Now, the writer Dan Pink, who some of you may be familiar with, writes about this phenomenon in his book Drive, that at a certain point, humans are no longer incentivized really by money, but rather by three other things: autonomy, an urge to direct their own lives, mastery, the desire to get better at something that matters, and purpose, yearning to do what we do in the service of something bigger than ourselves. So there's a theory behind all of this, and it's been developed by this guy. His name is Clay Shirky, and he's come up with something that he calls cognitive sorry, forgive me. Here we are, sorry. He's come up with something called cognitive surplus. And it's the idea that there is a whole lot of surplus brain power in the world, right, that's not being used. And in order to harness it, you need to have two things. You need to have the world's free time and talent. He estimates that's about 1 trillion hours a year of time, and the desire to create and share. Now, if you have ever posted pictures on Facebook of your kids or your cats, you know what I mean by the second one. It's an innate human trait, this desire to create and share. It makes us feel good. It makes us feel like we are in the know. I don't know how many of you have ever watched an award ceremony or a sports event with your iPhone on Twitter. But if you haven't, you should do it the next time Downton Abbey's on or the Super Bowl, because you will be amazed at the thoughts and the insights and the wisdom and observations that people from around the world are sharing simply because they want to be part of it. So a practical example of this is Linux, which many of you have heard of. It's an open source operating system that is continuously being refined by its users. I think one of the other great examples of cognitive surplus is this, lolcats, okay? Literally, hundreds of thousands of people have posted millions of these pictures online with these stupid captions. These are some of the most widely shared memes in history. In fact, more people will see a lolcat in one day than read Gutenberg's Bible in the 50 to 100 years after its publication. So next time somebody says that this is not relevant, you can explain that this is actually incredibly relevant and important and profound, more profound than Gutenberg's Bible, possibly. There are all kinds of examples of these types of collaboration happening every day. And the reason people do this is simple. Again, it's this human desire to be part of something bigger. We all thought the internet was going to create these societies of siloed individuals where we were disconnected from one another, but actually new types of mass collaboration have come about. New collaborative communities have come about through the internet. And it's not just, about sharing lolcats. It's about really tackling things that matter to people. People are tapping into cognitive surplus, not just to make cool stuff, but to actually make our governments better and more efficient. So this is Jennifer Polka. She started something called Code for America a few years ago. And the idea came to her because she got tired of people complaining about government, saying that it was useless and inefficient and bureaucratic. So she created Code for America in order to address this. So she brought together a bunch of computer coders, friends of hers, and she sent them all across the country. And she said, go to community municipalities, go to cities, find out what their problems are, see if you can start to address some of those problems. And what those coders found when they got to those cities was that people really wanted to be part of the solution. Ordinary people wanted to engage. They wanted to play a role. They just didn't know how. So one of the first projects to address this problem started in Boston. And in Boston, every time it snowed, the fire hydrants in the city, they get snowed under too. And this is actually very dangerous. The fire department can't get to those hydrants. So one of her coders created an app called Adopt a Hydrant. And the way it works is that if you pledge to keep your hydrant clear of snow after a huge storm, you get to adopt it. You can, do whatever you want to. You can name it. It's your hydrant. You get to name it on the internet, and you're its adoptive parent. And if you have that honor of adopting a hydrant, you get to paint it if you want to. You can do stuff like that to your hydrant. It's yours. But if you fail to clear the snow from the hydrant, you lose it. And since this program was launched in Boston, it's actually been incredibly successful at keeping hydrants clear, simply because people wanted to adopt hydrants. They wanted to be part of something. Similar thing happened in Hawaii with tsunami sirens. It turns out that tsunami sirens run on batteries. And apparently these batteries are stolen quite often. Sometimes birds nest in these sirens, and tsunami sirens are obviously important in Hawaii, but a significant percentage of them at any given time are inoperable, don't work. So a coder from her community built a program where people were allowed to adopt these sirens. And again, in Hawaii, it's been incredibly successful, with people allowed to name their hydrants and paint their sirens and paint their sirens, and they just need to check on them every few weeks to make sure they're operable. Now, some of this may seem trivial, right? A fire hydrant or a tsunami siren, but the reality is that it exposes the possibilities and the things that we can do without a whole lot of money if we can figure out how to harness our talent and collaborate. I think what Code for America does is the same thing that all these other movements I've been talking about do as well. They develop leaders, they create an organization, they gather together around a shared purpose, a shared mission, and they create a narrative, a story. Now, if you notice, I haven't talked a lot about the less abstract things that many of us, I would argue, overemphasize in our community. My friend Dan Pallotta, who spoke here last year, mentions the scourge of overhead, the obsessive, and what he argues the corrosive quest to keep overhead costs low so as to satisfy the impression that your organization is efficient and maximizing its potential. And Dan has made that argument powerfully, so I won't repeat it here, but there's also, I think, a lot of energy spent on things like social media and internet campaigns and celebrity endorsements and foundation grants, things that most organizations believe they have to do well in order to do good. But I would argue that you can't mount a successful social media campaign or viral video without the other ingredients for the foundation. And the internet is a powerful tool. Coney 2012 proved that. But Invisible Children wasn't simply using the internet to deliver a message to an organization. It was using the internet to deliver a message to an organization it built over 10 years. The civil rights movement delivered a message through Rosa Parks to the organization it built. And so the story matters. Your narrative matters. How you tell your story, how you frame it matters. But the story isn't enough without the foundation and without the exchange of ideas. Now, as I've come to understand what this community, InsideNGO, stands for, I've discovered that really what it's about is to help facilitate cross-collaboration and collective leadership, all under the same umbrella of a shared mission to make the world a little bit better. But I find that even in my own organization and in many nonprofits, we don't always create space for failure. We're so worried about what other people would think, about outside criticism, about what our funders will say, whether change will upset them. But I think that this kind of thinking is also an impediment to innovation. And so to mitigate some of that uncertainty, I think all of us in the nonprofit world really need to think deeply about cross-collaboration and about how that kind of scalability can maximize impact and minimize risk. NPR actually did that 2 years ago when we decided to partner with TED. We decided to put an investment of time and money into this new show. Now, it was unprecedented because we are two different cultures. We're both nonprofits. They have a very strong culture. We have a very strong culture. We're a news organization. They're a content and live events organization. They had to trust us with their content. We had to trust them with our brand. There was a lot of friction. There was a lot of tension, and there was a lot of uncertainty over whether the partnership would actually last. We didn't actually know if it would last. At times, we were at each other's throats, almost literally. A lot of people say literally these days when they don't actually mean literally. It wasn't literally. Almost literally. But over time, we've actually grown into a mutual admiration society and have not just become friends, but real partners. In a little more than a year after we launched, this program became the fastest growing show in the history of public radio. This is a show that is now on 500 radio stations, and that is the third highest, most downloaded podcast in the English-speaking world. Now, it was a risk. It was a risk of money and time, but it was a gamble. But it really would have sucked if we tried this gamble alone and it failed. If it failed and we did it together, it would have sucked a lot less. Thankfully, it didn't. But the point of it is that we could take that risk and know that there was a possibility it was going to fail because we worked together. But over time, we found our shared narrative, and that narrative is a mission to build a community of optimists. That really is what our show is about. That's what we try to do every week on the radio. We want to leave you thinking about the world in a slightly different way. It doesn't mean that we want you or we expect you to go and join a Tibetan monastery and wear orange robes. But if you do that, please email me because I would love to be able to point out that example of a listener changed by our show. We want you to just look up at the stars at night and remember that sense of wonder that you had. And it really worked. It was really an experiment that worked, and an experiment that worked because we came together around a shared mission and we collaborated to make it happen. So I attend conferences, public radio conferences, which are very similar to this, I can tell you. In fact, I think I've seen some people here who have been at public radio conferences because so many of you look familiar. And I know that one of the things that happens at conferences is, you hear people speak, people like me come up and we talk and we speak. But we don't really think about what happens the day after. And I think it's really important to think about who is in this room and who can you partner with. Who are the people in this room who you can collaborate with, who share your interests? Where do they dovetail? What are their strengths? What can they bring to what you do that you don't have? What skills do they have? I mean, in today's world where resources are shrinking, we all know that, where the barriers to entry have been practically eliminated in almost every field, certainly in our world, in media. Survival equals collaboration. It depends on collaboration. And I think through the collaboration that you do, and that we all do, you will begin to find that simple and powerful and clear narrative. We're here in Washington, D.C. This is my home city. I live here. It also happens to be the place where the hardcore punk movement was founded. This is, strangely enough, D.C. was where the hardcore punk movement was founded. Many people do not realize this. One of the icons of that movement is somebody I count as a friend and a mentor. His name is Ian MacKaye. This is what he looked like in 1982 on stage. He looks just slightly older, but basically the same, especially in front of a microphone. His bands, Minor Threat and Fugazi, really changed a significant part of the world for a significant contingent of his generation. A few weeks ago, I was talking with him about a roadblock that I was facing at work. over an idea that I felt passionately about, an idea that I really believed could change the way we operate at NPR. And I was close to throwing in the towel, really close. Actually, that day I was ready to throw in the towel and just move on. A project that I'd been working on for more than a year. And without missing a beat, Ian MacKay told me one of the most profound things that I have ever heard, something that I have now taped to my computer. And this is what he says. He says, a new idea creates friction. And if the friction scares you, you will never change the world. And it was such a powerful thing that he said to me that I didn't drop that idea. I think that as you think about where you are and where this conference is headed and some of the things that you want to do, I would say create your ideas, take them out into the world, understand there will be friction, and accept that that is actually the only path. It's the only way you will make that difference and that change that motivated you, all of us really, to decide to do what we do, and to decide to do it in a meaningful way. We all made sacrifices in life to do something meaningful, to make a difference in the world, to enter a noble enterprise. So thank you for all that you do. It really is meaningful to me to be here as a nonprofit employee, a representative, I guess, of the media wing of the nonprofit world, and to address you. I'm honored, I'm humbled, and inspired by you, and I wish you all great success in changing the world for the better. Thank you.